5,000 reasons. The town of Pineville, Missouri had a way of knowing things about a man before he'd finished his morning coffee. It was a small place, tight-grained and particular, and Ernest Dills had given the people there plenty to know. He was the town barber, which carried a certain station, though Ernest had spent considerable effort squandering whatever dignity the position might have afforded him. The men who sat in his chair watched him through the mirror with the cautious eyes of people who've learned that a man holding a straight razor needn't necessarily be trusted. He drank, and not discreetly. He wandered the quiet streets in the evenings with the unfocused gaze of someone who'd lost the thread of the conversation an hour ago. He fished when he should have been cutting hair, and he kept the barbershop door locked in the middle of the day with a regularity that people eventually stopped pretending to find surprising. His wife Maggie covered for him with the patience of a woman who'd made her calculations early in the marriage and decided to honor them regardless of the outcome. She put him to bed when he couldn't manage it himself. She made excuses to the men waiting on the barbershop steps. She told anyone who would listen that his afternoons down at Big Sugar Creek were nothing more than a man's need for quiet, which was the kind of explanation that was technically true and completely misleading at the same time. They were poor in the way that Pineville, Missouri understood poverty in 1930. Not spectacularly, not dramatically, but with a relentless daily intimacy that showed itself in small ways. The house sat a block from the town square and needed paint. Their daughter Mary wore dresses that had been mended so many times that the original fabric was mostly theoretical. She went to school in shoes with holes worn through the soles, and she carried lunches that the other children noted and filed away for future reference. Mary bore all of it with a composure that the other children couldn't quite figure out how to breach, which frustrated them considerably. Then Ernest didn't come home. It happened on a night in spring when the creek had been running high and fast for a week. Maggie waited until the dark had gone fully solid before she let herself understand he wasn't coming. In the morning, she called the county sheriff's office with the controlled voice of a woman making a practical inquiry. He wasn't in the jail. The deputy said he'd pass word along. 3 hours later, the telephone rang with the urgency that telephones acquire when the news on the other end is bad. The sheriff's voice was careful and deliberate, the way men's voices get when they've had to do this before. Ernest's fishing pole had been found on the bank of Big Sugar Creek. His jacket, wallet still inside, had been recovered from a tree branch where the current had deposited it. The creek was well out of its banks. The Elk River, which the creek fed into, was running above flood stage. The sheriff said what sheriffs are obligated to say in such situations, and Maggie listened to all of it without speaking. The search ran for days. Deputies walked the banks. They went downstream as far as the current might have carried a man. A shoe surfaced eventually, waterlogged and misshapen, and Maggie identified it as Ernest's with a quietness that the sheriff would remember for a long time. There was no body. In the end, there was only the sheriff's voice on the telephone again, telling her what the absence of evidence had already told her, which was that Ernest was gone and they weren't going to find him. There was no funeral service. Maggie had neither the money nor the emotional architecture for one, and she was a practical woman at her core. She moved forward with the grinding efficiency of someone who's decided that forward is the only available direction. The call from the insurance agent came on a Tuesday. Maggie sat very still while the man explained about the policy, about the sum, about the procedures that would need to be followed. $5,000. In 1930 in Pineville, Missouri, $5,000 was the kind of money that rearranged the way people understood a life. Maggie thanked the man and held the receiver in her hand for a moment after she'd hung up, looking at nothing. She fixed the house. She bought Mary proper shoes and dresses that didn't require the sustained intervention of a needle and thread. She put the remainder in the Pineville bank and let it sit there, earning the quiet interest of money that expects to stay for a while. A few years on, she met a man named Philip Masterson, who owned the lumber mill. A decent and steady presence, who looked at Maggie and Mary and found in them something worth tending to. They married. The school children stopped laughing at Mary. She started sharing her lunch rather than defending it. Maggie's second husband died in 1940, a heart attack that came for him quickly and without ceremony. Maggie and Mary went on. In 1945, Maggie herself took ill, and one morning in autumn, she didn't wake up. Mary arranged the service at the Methodist church, and the church filled completely. every pew occupied by people who'd watched Maggie navigate 30 years of difficulty with a kind of quiet grace they were only now realizing they should have mentioned to her while she was alive. They buried her in the Pineville Cemetery that afternoon, in ground that held markers for both Ernest and Philip. The mourners dispersed in the slow, reluctant way of people who aren't ready to let the day become ordinary again. Mary stayed. She stood at the grave and let the silence settle around her. The afternoon light came through the cemetery oaks at a low angle, cutting the shadows long across the grass. She was deep in the kind of thinking that the dead invite in the living when she became aware that someone was standing a few feet away. The man was older. He had the careful posture of someone who'd learned to take up only the space he absolutely needed. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "Are you Mary?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss." He paused. "Your mother was a fine woman." He paused again, and something moved behind his eyes. "I knew her better than most." Mary looked at him. She took in the way he was standing, the angle of his jaw, the eyes that she recognized the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you only half learned. "Can I ask your name, sir?" she said. "You remind me of someone. There's something about you that is so very familiar." "Folks call me Bud," he replied with a sly grin. He told her she'd grown into a beautiful woman. He told her to stay happy. Then he walked away through the oak trees and the long shadows, and Mary watched him go without saying another word. Several days later, the retired Sheriff Claiborne stopped by to check on her. He sat in her front room with his hat in his hands and made the small talk of a man working towards something. Eventually, he got to it. Several people at the funeral, he said, had remarked on a man they'd seen in town that afternoon, someone who reminded them, oddly enough, of Ernest Dills. He smiled at the strangeness of it. Of course, Ernest had drowned years ago, though he said, almost to himself, that if a man had wanted to disappear, that rainy spring would have offered him a reasonable opportunity. The flooding, the missing body, the wallet in the water, it would have worked out quite well for everyone, really, if that's the direction a man's mind went. He looked at Mary. Mary looked back at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. "Thanks for dropping by, Mr. Claiborne," she said.